Hello and welcome to BookFest for Schools 2022. It is my privilege to introduce to you some of the finest authors, illustrators and poets from across the globe to fuel the fires of your imaginations. Our first artist today is from the other side of the globe. His name is Zohab Zee Khan. Zohab Zee Khan has poetry in his bones. Zohab Zee Khan has rhythm in his soul. Rhythm and poetry, poetry and rhythm. Zohab Zee Khan is a performance poet from Australia, winner of the Poetry Slam Championships. He is a high-energy performer who can move his frame into all sorts of unusual shapes like a coat hanger, who lives his poetry through his limbs. Zohab Zee Khan has not always had an easy walk in life. Growing up as a Pakistani in rural Australia, he sadly had to face unkind words and actions based on what he looked like. But it's made him stand tall. And the experiences that he's lived and have made him strong, he puts into his poetry. He writes not to fight, but to love. He writes not to fight, but to love. He writes about home, what it means to belong. He writes about the world. He asks, what if? What if this world was made of people who treated each other equally? It is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you the verbally versatile Zohab Zee Khan.
Hello, hello, hello. My name is Zohab Zee Khan, and I am a poet. And it is great to be a part of this year's book festival because I really like books. And I really like writing, and I really like writing poems. I'm a poet, and I think you're a poet too. I think absolutely everybody is a poet. They just don't know it. A lot of people do know it though. The reason I think every single person is a poet, and there's a reason I think every single person has written poetry before, and there's a reason I think every single person has performed poetry before, is because I think the definition of poetry is one or more words. As long as one or more words has left your mouth and gone out into the world, you are a poet. As long as one or more words has left your pen or your pencil and danced on a piece of paper, on a page or on a wall or wherever, you are a poet. As long as one or more words has come out of here, from here, from here, from here, into people's ears, you're a poet. And I know that may sound like a very weird definition of poetry. And I know that may sound like a little bit different of a definition than what your teachers or your parents or your librarians or even Bourneville BookFest has told you poetry is. But that's how I define it. And I think that's a great place to start. And from there, you can keep building and writing amazing poems. So let's do that. A great way to get ideas for poems is to just have a little bit of a daydream. And I do that a lot. Sometimes I daydream when I'm not supposed to be daydreaming. And some of my best ideas come from a daydreaming situation. Another great way to come up with ideas for poems is to imagine that your topic that you've decided to write a poem about has just walked into the door and has joined you in your room. And that's what I do quite a lot. I imagine, the idea that I have for a poem has just walked in through the door. What is it trying to do to me? What is it trying to do to the other people in the room? What does this idea smell like? What does this idea talk like? What is this idea doing? How does it move? Does it dance? Does it twirl? What does this idea do? And that's how I write a lot of my poems, and that's how I get ideas for a lot of my poems. Would you like to hear a poem? I imagine you're saying yes. The poem I'm going to do was written just like that. It was written by thinking, I want to write a poem about why I write poems. So I thought about the idea of poem writing walking in through the door. And I was like, what would it do? And I imagined it would dance and twirl. And I imagined it would tell people not to pose because you can't pose when you write prose poetry. And I imagined that it would twirl like a mystic insouciant dervish around and around, around and around. I also imagined that the reason writing poetry walked in through the door was to tell me something. It was to tell me that the reason I write poetry is not because I want to be angry and I want to fight with people, but rather because I want to share love and I want to share kindness and I want to share niceness. And that's the reason that I write poetry. So here is my poem called I Write. And this poem is a very special poem to me because this poem is the poem that I entered into the Australian National Poetry Slam Championships many years ago in the final round, and I was lucky enough to win the championships with this poem.
Zohab Zee Khan, Australian Poetry Slam.
So, see if you can listen and see if you can see how I got the ideas for a poem walking in, or poem writing walking in through the door. I write. I write not to fight, but to love. I write not to fight, but to love. I write not to fight, but to bring light to darkness. I write not to fight, but to bring sight to blindness. I write to inspire an internal fire in those that desire to fly higher, for my feet were never designed for the ground. I prefer to walk on the clouds where my footsteps make not a and I can twirl like a mystic insouciant dervish around and around, around and around. I write to tell those who pose not to pose, because you can't pose when you write prose poetry. Your mind set it free and fall hopelessly in love with the love of poetry, but to some it seems that the only rhyme schemes be A, B, B, and A, B, and A, B, A. But that's just not my way. It's just that I prefer A, B, H, and A. And A, B, T, Z, K. And $, question mark, 7 exclamation point, hash star, 4 = sign, plus sign, 666, open bracket, close bracket, XXX, smiley face, percentage, 7, P, 7, Q, W, R, T, Y, 7, A, B, B, A, B, B, A. And that's why I prefer not to confine my mind to pre-written lines. I prefer to set free my mind in a place where elastic lines intertwine with mystic rhymes. In these sadistic times, it's hard to find oneself. Materialistic objects should not define oneself. That's why I write. I write not to fight, but to love. I write not to fight, but to love. And that was my poem, I Write. And just like I said before, the way I came up with the idea for that poem was I imagined that poem writing walked in through the door and had a conversation with me and said, well, there's all these different rhyme schemes that you could use, AABB and ABB and ABBA. And I thought, well, I don't want to use those rhyme schemes. I want to just go absolutely everywhere that I want to go. So that's a really good way to get ideas for poems. Imagine it's just walked in through the door. Your imagination is a great tool to use when writing poetry. And I know I said before that poetry is one or more words, and I stand by that definition, but a more precise way to define poetry is condensed language. Poetry is rhythmical language. Poetry is language that you use to express yourself. Poetry is about adding rhyme and rhythm. Poetry is about making your words so strong that people have no choice but to listen. Poetry is about adding alliteration and personification. Poetry is about making people happy and sad and making them cry and laugh and making them ask questions of one another. Poetry is about sisters and brothers, misters and missuses, and snakes that slither. Poetry is about getting all those ideas outside of you and letting the world know. See, the reason I do poetry is because I was always a very shy kid. I know, hard to believe. I was always very, very quiet, but I had all these amazing ideas inside of my brain that I wanted to tell absolutely everyone. And that's why I think poetry is incredible. And that's why if you want to become really good at writing poetry, the first step is get all your ideas out. Doesn't matter how you write them down. Get your ideas out of your brain onto pieces of paper. All those conversations that you want to have with your friends, write them down on pieces of paper and see what happens. And then you add some spice. Poetry is all about adding spice to your words. You add some rhyme. They're words that have a rhythmical nature that sound very similar. Or you could add some rhythm. Or maybe you can add some personification. I really like personification. Personification is where you have an inanimate object, something that's not alive, and you give it human characteristics. You can say that the wall is staring. Or you could say that the tree is dancing. To make something more human-like makes it sound really, really cool and paints images into people's brains. That's what poetry is about. That's why I like doing poetry. Poetry is about painting pictures in people's brains. Poetry is about making people feel things on the inside. And that's my next tip. So if you're going to be writing poems, a really good place to start is to write about something that's important to you. And it doesn't really matter if it's not important to anybody else in the entire world, as long as it's important to you. I've known people that have wrote poems about their mums, about the sun, about their bums. As long as it's important to you, it doesn't really matter what the poem is about. And the best poems are the poems that you write that have a meaning to you. So if you do want to write a poem today, or if you do want to write a poem with all those poetic techniques that I told you about earlier, like those rhymes and those rhythms and the alliteration and personification and assonance. Oof, we're using a lot of words. If you do want to use those in your poems, think about the things that are important to you. Think about the topics that mean a lot to you. And see what happens from there. That's how I write a lot of my poems as well. Sometimes I'm just hanging out with my best friends in the world and we're having a chat and we're talking and we're watching TV and we're like, And we have a really cool conversation. And we talk about the things that are important to us. The things that we believe on the inside. And then those are the things that turn into poems. Like this one time, I was hanging out with one of my best friends in the entire world. He's a really, really cool guy. And he's really, really smart. And we come from different cultures. And we were watching TV. And we were watching the news. And sometimes the news gets really sad. And sometimes the things that are on TV are a little bit worrying. And we were watching some worrying news, and it was actually about our background cultures. And they were fighting somewhere in the world, and something not so nice was happening between us, between our cultures. And we thought, That's actually really, really sad. And we had this really, really nice conversation about, imagine that kind of stuff didn't happen. Imagine people were just like us, and we just hung out and were really, really kind to each other and loved each other very much and said nice things and made sure that we took care of one another. Imagine those types of worlds. What would that look like? And we talked about it and we talked about it and we talked about it, and I said, you know what? This is a poem. If all these things happened, this would be a poem. So if you do want to write a poem, a really good way to do it would be think about the things that are important to you and have a conversation about it with one of your best friends. Or you can have a conversation about it with your class. Or you can have a conversation about it with your parents or your teachers or your pets. I'm not sure if your pet will talk back, but you can try. And see what comes out of that conversation, and then see what type of poem you can write. And try to use things like alliteration, which is the repetition of the same letter again and again and again, like bu 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 bu, pu 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 pu, k k k k k. My favorite alliteration of all time comes from one of my favorite rappers named Tupac, and he starts one of his songs with "Picture perfect, I paint a perfect picture. Picture perfect, I paint a perfect picture. Pa 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 pa." Or bouncing balls. Bounce. That's another one. Would you like to hear the poem that I wrote that one day after I had that conversation with my amazing friend, who is a very kind, amazing, cool person? I imagine you're saying yes. Here goes. So this poem is a poem we had after our conversation. Imagine. Imagine a world where people are treated as equals. Imagine a world where people are not categorized by skin tone, religion, gender, or size. Imagine a world viewed through the innocence of a child's eyes. Imagine no sorrow when a soul dies, for a soul flies after closed eyes. We try to live our lives in New York minutes. 'Cause we be pushing our lives to new world limits and new world orders, while the old world still busy burying daughters. For they prefer sons, only for those sons to pick up guns and hurt sons of righteous ones, and those righteous ones tell their sons that those sons hurt their sons, so their sons hurt those sons, and sons hurt sons, and sons hurt sons, and sons hurt sons, and Sun Tzu was wrong. For there is no art in war, for art is love, and there's no love in war. Imagine we loved more, and loved for the sake of love, for the love of love is the best love above all. Imagine a world of no wars, and hearts with no doors exposed raw. Imagine the life of another being the life of a brother. Imagine every embrace filled with the love of our mothers. Imagine a world of no strangers and only kindred neighbors. It's about time hatred gets outdated and our differences are celebrated. For our forefathers waited, but we, the people, shall wait no more. Today we take our stand. Imagine no French burqa bands and bikinis in Afghanistan. Imagine Hong Kong Hanukkah and white Christmas Mecca. Imagine no offshore refugee process prisoners and a history of indigenous prime ministers. Imagine Palestinians marry Israelis and make beautiful beige babies. Imagine a world where people are treated as equals. Imagine a world where people are not categorized by skin tone, religion, gender, or size. Imagine. And that's one of my favorite poems. And the reason it's one of my favorite poems is because it's something that's really, really important to me. And I really enjoy performing that poem, and it came out of a conversation. It came out of, having a think about what a world would look like if we were just a lot kinder to one another, where we didn't put each other into all these little categories like they were doing on the TV, and not like me and my friend were doing, my friend and I were doing. So that's a really cool way to get ideas for poems as well. There are lots of different types of poems. You may know about limericks and narrative poems and blank verse poems and found poems. 3 of my favorite poems are free verse poems, haiku poems, and acrostic poems. They're all really fun poems to write. And I think that's one of the most important parts of poetry, is to make sure that whilst you're doing poetry, you're having fun. Because that's what poetry is about for me. It's about expressing myself and making sure that I have a lot of fun whilst I express myself. Let me tell you a little bit about haikus. Haikus are really short poems. They seem simple to write, but they can be quite challenging. They're all about syllable use. They're 3 lines, and in the first line, you have 5 syllables. In the second line, you have 7 syllables, and in the third line you have 5 syllables again. So it's a 5-7-5 poem. And a syllable is that up sounds that make up words. The word syllable has syllable, 3 syllables. The word Tyrannosaurus Rex has 6 syllables. So here are 2 of my favorite haikus. Let me read them for you. This haiku is called Good Morning Haiku from the Cat. It's written from a cat's perspective. In the morning light, you sleep despite my meow. I stand on your face. Here's another haiku. This one is a haiku for babies. You're so cute, but why should I write a haiku for you? You can't even read. So haikus are very silly, they're very short, and they do take a lot of time to master and figure out that you're getting the right amount of syllables in each line. So if you want to try a haiku, all I suggest is sound out those words and figure out how many syllables there are in each word, and try to get 5 in your first line, 7 syllables in your second line, and 5 syllables in your third line, and you'll have a haiku. Another important thing about writing poetry is don't try too hard. Just write whatever comes out, and you can always fix it a little bit later. And that brings me to one of my other favorite styles of poems, and that's called the free verse poem. And a free verse poem is where you dance on the piece of paper on your page and do whatever you need to do. You don't worry about rhyme structures. You don't worry about, like I was saying in my first poem I did for you, about rhyme schemes like AABB and ABBA and all those other things. All you need to do with a free verse poem is write. Make it sound rhythmical, put some rhyme here, put some personification there, put some alliteration there, wherever you need to put it. And that is one of my other favorite styles of poems, which is a free verse poem. The final style of poem that I'd like to discuss with you is an acrostic poem. And acrostic poems are pretty fun to do. Acrostic poems are when you put a word down your page. Maybe you've done one in class. An acrostic poem is when you put a word down your page and each line of your poem starts with the first letter of that word. Let me give you an example. I wrote an acrostic poem just for you, you amazing BookFest peoples that are watching this video. So I started with the word happiness. So I wrote the word, well, I typed the word happiness down my page. And then I thought about how I could start the first line with the word H, and then the second line with an A and a P and a P and an I and an S and an N and an E and an S and an S. So would you like to hear the poem that I wrote? Of course you would. I'm going to imagine you're saying yes. And this is the poem that I ended up with. So I've got happiness down, and then happiness. Happiness is a moment of laughter with a friend, a moment of joy that seems like it will never end. Perfect points in time, poems placed with perfectly placed rhymes. Illuminate my insides, new adventures will come, just wait a while. Every moment is happiness waiting to appear. Sit still and happiness will be here. Sit still and just breathe, my friend. That's my poem about happiness. And that's what happiness means to me. And that's a really great way of writing a poem. Just put a word down the side of your page and you have a really good start to a poem. So just to sum up everything that I know, well, not everything that I know about poetry, poetry is just about self-expression. Poetry is about getting ideas out of yourself. Poetry is about letting the world know who you are, why you are, and the things that are important to you. You can put little bits of rhyme and little bits of rhythm and little bits of alliteration and a little bit of personification. But for me, the most important thing about poetry is to have fun. The most important thing about poetry is to make sure you're enjoying yourself whilst you're doing it and you're letting the world know a little bit more about the incredible person each and every single one of you are. So, maybe you've already written a poem today. Maybe you haven't written a poem today. Maybe you've never written a poem in your entire life. What I encourage you to do is write as many poems as you can. Write a poem a day because it's one of the best things that you can do for yourself. All you need is a pen, a pencil, some paper, a laptop, a crayon, a wall. Don't put poems on walls. I don't think your parents would like that. Just write poetry. Whatever comes to your brain, let it out on a piece of paper and do what you need to do. Okay, that's me done. Thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you for everyone over at the Bourneville BookFest. I've had a really cool time talking about poetry and performing some of my poems. Have a great rest of your festival. Bye-bye.